Hi, my name is Tanner Smith, and I am in Mr. Pivko's class for Comp 2. I am doing this oral presentation for our final exam that he asked us to do. I did my research project on a book called A Land Remembered by Patrick D. Smith. He published this book in 1984, and it covers a century of old Florida and the family of McIvies that traveled through it. The McIvies, as they traveled through Florida, they wrote down a map, a personal map, that their family has traveled and why they were there. What I found in my research was that a lot of these places correlated with the actual map of Florida. This was my project, was to find what places match and don't match in correlations to the map that McIvies wrote, to the road atlas map of 2019 that Rand McNally produced. In my findings, there was a lot of places that matched up. Forts, there were 3 forts and a battle that was talked about: Fort Drum, Fort Pierce, and Fort Dallas. Those were all talked about and used in the story as battle places. And on the actual map, there are 3 places: Fort Pierce, Fort Drum, and Fort Dallas in Florida that correlate with both maps. The Battle of 10,000 Islands was in the story, and it was talked about kind of towards the end. And the 10,000 Islands is actually a place in South Florida, in the Gulf of Mexico side. Also, places like Kissimmee, Punta Rasa, and Tampa were talked about. Those are very well-known places along Florida, and they correlated directly on both sides through the road atlas and the book. I did this because I read this story at a very young age with my grandma, and when the story got over, I looked at the map, and I didn't really know Florida that well. I didn't know the maps. I was very young, and I kind of was interested in knowing where the places were that they were talking about, such as the Drown that they talked about, or the railroad that they talked about, and the trading post. I then figured out that the trading post was actually in Moorhaven, Florida. And I read it again for a class project in my freshman year of high school. It was an ag project that we had to read a certain amount of chapters a day and write what we thought about them. And that struck my interest on finding out again. And then I took Mr. Pivko's class, and he actually gave me the opportunity to pursue this in a presentation and get a grade for it. So I was off on my journey. I found my A Land Remembered book that I was given a few years back, and I found this road atlas in my dad's truck in case the maps go out on your phone. You always have to have a road atlas. And I got to work. A few sources that I had to use were the 2019 Rand McNally Road Atlas and the book A Land Remembered by Patrick D. Smith. Those were my major 2 sources because I really had to do a lot of research by myself and write down the places in the map of the book, and then look through the road atlas of Florida and line the 2 searches up, write them down for myself, and then put them into my story. I also had to use a few minor sources to figure out why the family went there in the first place, like why they went to Punta Rasa, why they went to Tampa, why they went to the Seminole tribe that we'll talk about later. my surprise about the story, why I was surprised, was I didn't actually think that more than half of the places on the map were real places. And that really struck my interest on what other places they might have been that they didn't talk about or they didn't write down on the map. They could have very well come to Palatka and where I am, and I thought that was very interesting. Some challenges that I faced throughout this research paper was, the major one was definitely lack of information. There wasn't very much that was already done research prior to this, so I really had to figure it out all by myself. Another challenge that I faced was a minor one, but it was definitely a challenge. The map in the book was meant to be set back a few years in time, quite a few years in time, and the map was a little bit unproportional, and the lakes were in a little bit different places than they should have been, and the shape of Florida was a little off, and I kind of had to get dirty and down to it and figure out what places went with it. I could have been a few miles off, but I figured I got pretty close. This took a long time for me to figure out, 2 or 3 days of searching through the book to figure out the places that they were actually talking about. A place they talked about a lot was the Seminole tribe, Seminole Reservation in South Florida. They talked about this because Zeke McIvy, which was the second generation McIvy, he had a mistress who was Indian, and he had a son from her who was half-blood Indian and McIvy. So he had to keep this a secret from his wife and other son, and he had to keep the kid on their Indian reservation, and he visited them. He'd do all different activities on the reservation with him, and when Zeke's other son got older, he came and visited the half-blood Indian son, and that was another time that the Seminole tribe was talked about. I found it interesting that looking at the road atlas, that there's actually an Indian reservation on the place that they're talking about. It's a Seminole tribe called the Big Cypress, and they get tons of visitors each year to just come and look on the land. And I gained from the story a greater knowledge of what I was reading. If I ever go back and read the story again, I will understand more places, like when they talk about Punta Rasa, which Punta Rasa is actually Punta Rasa. When they say the railroad or the trading post or the drown, I will now know that the drown is towards mid-Florida, and it is actually Dixie Ranch Acres, which is a cattle company, and the drown they talk about in the story was a cattle drive. I hope that other people gain knowledge from this and they can better understand the story too, and realize that it's a lot closer to home than you actually realize. And I enjoyed doing this research because it not only was it for a final grade, but it was definitely for my interest too.